Toyota Material Handling is now providing a factory rebate of up to $2,500 when you trade in a Toyota or a competitive unit. Now, through September 30th, 2024, trade in your forklift and get a new industry-leading Toyota forklift. This rebate applies to electric and internal combustion models. Unlock your upgrade today by visiting toyotaforklift.com. That's toyotaforklift.com, or click the link in the show notes.
Welcome to this week's bonus episode of the New Warehouse Podcast. Originally broadcast live on LinkedIn, this conversation features the authors of the book, The Warehouse Revolution, Automate or Terminate. We dive into what each one of the authors considers to be the warehouse revolution, why automation sees struggles in adoption, and what it means for the future of warehousing. And a special congratulations to Derek Thorslin and Ed Kennedy, who both won a copy of the book during the live session.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
All right, we are live here with the New Warehouse Podcast on LinkedIn, and I am very excited for today's conversation. We have some great supply chain professionals joining me today, and also authors now of the book, The Warehouse Revolution. So I am going to be joined today by Pete Devenny, Jim Stolenberg, Miguel Pinilla, and they are the authors of The Warehouse Revolution, which I think right now for our industry is maybe like the Bible of warehousing, the book for warehousing, I would say, at the moment, and certainly something that's a very, very interesting read. I've been reading through it over the last month or so since they sent me a copy very graciously ahead of this interview, and I've been enjoying it very, very much so. So I want to welcome Jim, Miguel, and Pete here as well. And I think it's important that we talk a little bit about their background first, because they all have extensive backgrounds within the industry that certainly makes them qualified to be able to write this book, and the book is great, as I mentioned before. So why don't we kick it off with Jim here and hear a little bit about your background, Jim?
Sure. Thanks for having us, Kevin. Jim Stolberg, and born and raised here in Wisconsin, dialing in here. Went to university and got my mechanical engineering degree, and realized quite early on that I loved problem solving and I loved engineering, but I didn't want to be an engineer. So I spent the first 10 years of my career in management consulting with a firm that's probably best known now as Accenture. And my first exposure to warehousing back then was a client of ours was Harley Davidson. And this was probably mid 90s, late 90s. And we built a brand new distribution center for their aftermarket and just kind of fell in love with that work. I thought it was fantastic. We had to pick the building and outfit it with all the technology, which was current at the time, and stood it up and had this incredible impact on the business through doing that. So I decided I wanted to do more of that. And that started my I suppose from there, another 20 plus years journey of working in the warehousing and automation space, first with a software company, and then subsequently with a very large global OEM integrator called Dematic, which is where Pete and Miguel and I met each other. Did that until 2018, and then left the industry and started my own advisory firm, mostly focused on investment areas in this industry and in and around the space, and doing some advisory work with companies that I like to work with.
Very interesting. All right. An extensive background there, definitely in the industry. And I was going to ask where you all three kind of came together, and you just said it there for me, Jim, within Dematic. So Pete, why don't you give us a little bit about your background and tell us how you kind of came into this industry?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And for me, a little bit different from Jim in that I've been, I would say, flip-flopping my career a little bit between telecommunications and logistics. Spent a fair amount of time in logistics earlier in my career, and then landed at RIM or BlackBerry, where I ran enterprise software for many years. And what I loved about that job in particular and that industry was it really changed the way people worked. It untethered us for the first time from our offices, and we could all begin to work remotely, which became more and more relevant over time. And we all know the trials and tribulations and successes and ultimate downfall of RIM or BlackBerry, at least as it relates to the device. But it was an invigorating time. And for me, I was looking to get back into logistics and maybe even more so just find a job that was as fulfilling and as transformative as BlackBerry was to telecommunications. And it was really about 10, 12 years ago or so that warehouse automation started to go through a shift. And just like the BlackBerry changed the way people worked, Dematic at the time was changing the way people bought things on the internet. And the warehouse became such a critical component of the supply chain. Automation was really taking on a whole new form. And for me, I wanted to work in an industry that really mattered to the world. And I really felt that warehouse automation was that space. And I got a chance to know Jim originally, who was my boss at the time at Dematic. And we got along incredibly well. Shortly after, met Miguel as well. And we really just had a lot of success at Dematic over the next several years. So that's kind of my story.
All right, very nice, and definitely interesting experience there, I'm sure, at RIM. I got to ask, I watched the movie on Hulu about the BlackBerry and everything. Did you watch that? Did it give you some memories there?
Well, yeah, and a whole bunch of new ones, I would say. And that it was, like any of these, it's very interesting. And I think if you squint enough, it tells the story of RIM. But it certainly took a lot of liberties as well, where many of us were shaking our heads saying, well, that's not quite exactly the way that it was for real. But it was an interesting movie for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate that, Pete. And how about we get some background here from Miguel as well to kind of round out the group?
Yeah, so let's start with my accent. My accent is from Spain. I'm from there originally. I came to this country for graduate school with a Fulbright grant and a master's and a doctorate, all in industrial mechanical engineering. I've been kind of a geek of this area all my life, both in academia and as well as in industry. And it's because I'm fascinated by this field where the physical world intersects with the information world, right? I mean, it's that fascinating, dirty interface that never ceases to provide challenges and interesting things to work on. I've been in both large companies like, and Jim mentioned, with Dematic, and then the parent company Kion Group, leading their research and strategy group. And then also in small startups. I was the CTO of a small company that was one of the first that launched a WMS as a software as a service. This was back when clouds were not called clouds, in 2005, 2006 or so. And also working on small and big boxes. I mean, within the four walls of the warehouse with automation and process control and things like that, as well as in the larger supply chain with moving containers, container ports, and so on, based on my experience with Navis. So you can see I'm a geek of supply chains, if you will, and it's because of that fascinating wealth of problems. Supply chains move the world, and we've become front page news in the last few years. But it is this really interesting area, and that's more or less me. And now I'm like Jim and Pete. working on problems and companies that interest me, advising companies. I'm always open to hear from new problems, new companies, and just for the fun of it, literally. So that's more or less me.
All right, and thank you for that background there from all three of you. And I think Miguel, you mentioned in there that you're a bit of a supply chain geek, and I think maybe all of us listening here could probably admit that we're a geek for some part of the supply chain. If you are a geek, I would say, give us a little applause reaction there as well. And we do see that we have a healthy audience here with 17 people listening in at the current moment. So I do want to take a second. I know that we mentioned that we are going to give away a copy of the book today to somebody that is tuned in here. So thank you so much for tuning in so far, and stay tuned for that for sure. So now let's dive into the book itself, The Warehouse Revolution. And I believe it's my understanding that I think the book initially was Pete's idea. So Pete, maybe tell us a little bit about where the idea for this book came from and how you kind of came about, just getting to this idea of it all.
We'll be back after a quick break.
When it comes to systems, you want something that will start showing results fast. You're looking for a tool that can enable your 3PL or warehouse to get to the next level. So why wait? That's why Carton Cloud provides supported, fast onboarding that can have your WMS up and running in hours, not months. Jump into Carton Cloud's easy-to-use workflows for all of your services, including cross-docking, serialized inventory tracking, e-commerce order fulfillment, and more. This software is built by logistics people for logistics people, and those logistics people are standing by to help train you and support you so that you can be successful with your customer. With 24/7 real-time reporting and free online training, you need to check out Carton Cloud for your operation. Take the next step in your operation by heading to cartoncloud.com/free-demo or click the link in the show notes.
Yeah. So for me, after I left Dematic, which was in around the middle of 2020, I got on this book writing binge, I would say. So I wrote my another book and thoroughly enjoyed the process, and also was always thinking about the fact that how difficult it was to, when I first entered the warehouse automation field, to really get myself up to speed, because there were just no books out there. And the more and more I talked to people, they all had the same experience. You learn by experience, you talk to as many people as you can, you read articles, you read publications, but there really was no book out there that could really provide any of us what we needed to know to get what I would call a jump start in this business. So as I was writing my other book, I had this idea that I kind of enjoyed the process and would like to write another one soon. And warehouse automation in general just seemed like an obvious choice, because I knew a lot about it, but I also knew that to write that book, I would have to do it with partners. Immediately thought about Jim and Miguel, who both have just a wealth of experience in this space. And on top of that, the three of us became good friends over the course of the last decade. And we thought it would be both a useful endeavor and also a very enjoyable process to go through to write a book of this nature together. It's a little bit easier and harder at the same time to write a book between three people as opposed to writing one on your own. So when you do write a book with three people, hopefully you pick three people that like each other and get along well and think kind of the same way. So that's how the book came together. And again, like everything else, it was really written to solve a problem for people. So hopefully they can get up to speed much more quickly than they otherwise would be able to in the space.
Truth be told, when Pete approached us, my initial thought was, no way I mean, being an engineer, the engineer in me said, I'm much better at, math and science than I am at authoring something. So the thought of writing a book kind of made me break out in hives. But if it wasn't for Pete's great salesmanship and just the respect that I have for Pete and Miguel, I thought it would be fun. So my opting in was more about Pete and Miguel and doing this on a journey together than it was about my desire to write. So.
Yeah. And the journey analogy is apt because the same way that you want to choose your partners in a road trip carefully because you're going to be with them for a while. So it's fortunate and not enough credit given to Pete on this because he stewarded us through this and acted as the scrum master, if you will, also on top of writing his parts and so on. So, but it was fabulous. It was fabulous and hard.
Well, I mean, it's great to hear how it kind of all came together, and I think it's very justified and warranted. I mean, Pete, what you said there about just kind of learning through just experience in the industry, I think is certainly the way it's been for quite a while. I mean, even if we look at just supply chain in general from an education standpoint, degrees in supply chain and things like that are relatively new in comparison to other degrees that are out there. So it's definitely a great window, I guess, that you saw there to be able to create this book. So Jim, I'm curious, I mean, why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of where the name came from, the Warehouse Revolution, and what is the Warehouse Revolution overall?
Yeah. Love to share that. We picked it carefully, and I guess it really kind of personifies what we feel like we went through when or have gone through as we've been in this space. And Kevin, I see on your host name it says warehouses are sexy, right? And I would say that's true today, but it hasn't always been that way. Right? When I started doing this work back in the late '90s, I think a lot of organizations, companies in particular, looked at it as more of a necessary evil. Right. The focus was on the sales and the marketing and the products. And it was, there's this afterthought of you have to get products out to a retail store or whatnot. I mean, when I started, there was no such thing as e-commerce. Right. So the first, if I think of the 25 years I've been in the space, the first half of that was relatively unsexy. Right. Mm-hmm. But the technology had come along and there was some interesting, there was ASRS and there was some level of software. I mean, software was still in its infancy, but the capabilities were somewhat limited. And the relative level of thinking at the C levels in organizations of what automation means, I think was, again, as I would say, more of an afterthought. After the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, really started to see a shift. And then, I would say, through the likes of, influential organizations like Amazon and others, it started to change the way we consume and fundamentally the way we now consume, which is really, we don't even think about just opening up an app on our phone and ordering something and expecting it to show up on our doorstep or, today or tomorrow has really, it caused a sea change to how we have to think about how warehouses and distribution centers operate. And ultimately makes it incredibly complex, right? The problems that we solve. So I think what we experienced in the industry was a sea change in how distribution is thought of, and therefore what technologies need to come to bear. And it forced, because of that change, it forced companies to invest more, but it also brought more money and more investment into the space. And so the technology started to advance at a much more rapid pace. So starting to see new technologies, even going back, say, like a decade or so, far outweighed the evolution of technology in the first half of my career. And so seeing the speed pick up and seeing the possibility of what could be done with this technology and the new solutions that could be put into place and how it solved real world problems, just became really exciting. And so it went from, I'd say, from being an afterthought to being a competitive advantage if you used it correctly to today. Probably the reason why we chose the subtitle of Automate or Terminate, it's for some, it's going to be survival. If you don't think this through and do it correctly, you may not be in business to get your products to market.
Very interesting there. And I think, that's such a underline there on that automate or terminate. I mean, to be able to understand that and start to, like you said, utilize your distribution and fulfillment as a competitive advantage within your business, you have to start to look at some of those technologies and push forward on that. So Peter, Miguel, anything to add to that?
Well, maybe I'll just jump in, and I would say that as Jim pointed out, the changes over the decades, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, that back in the 80s and 90s, there was, let's say, maybe very limited automation back in those days. And whatever automation there was, it was to help the manufacturers at the time, who were the power brokers, ship pallets of information to the retailers. And then as we got into the 2000s, the retailers became the power brokers, and no longer were they willing to accept pallets full of products from manufacturers, and they had to be broken down into cases. And that introduced all sorts of new technologies and complexities, because of course the pallet shipment didn't go away either. And then we got into the 2010s. The consumers themselves became the power brokers, and they weren't willing to accept cases of products, but rather eaches. Retailers were still primarily accepting cases, and distribution centers and others were accepting pallets. Sometimes retailers were accepting pallets. So all of a sudden, the number of permutations and combinations of technologies just rose to a whole new level. And warehouses became very, very complicated. Software became a critical element of the equation to make them work efficiently. And that is just continuing to new levels now as we introduce AI technologies, and the complexity of managing fleets of robots, et cetera, is resulting in an even more complicated second half of the 2020s here, but also a more interesting one where I think more warehouse operators are going to be investing in automation because there are lower cost options now, which perhaps gets them over a hurdle that they couldn't get over before.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important note there too, that it's, we're looking at different ways to approach these problems and then come up with these unique solutions, but there is a complexity that gets added to that there as well, which certainly makes some of these technologies very interesting. But then how do, some of these other players that are, not the big names out there start to get into that and start to understand that as well? Miguel, anything you want to add there to your thoughts on around the warehouse revolution itself?
With this explosion of complexities and needs for these technologies and so on, I started asking myself at one point, like, why on earth are we doing this to ourselves? We were very happy with our warehouses and all this kind of thing. So why is this happening? And I came, if I have to put my finger on something, is that the metrics, the how we measure the performance of supply chains and warehouses has been turned on its ear. Right. I mean, this is my engineer geek take on it. I mean, we used to reward supply chain managers on number of shipments and volume and cost per shipment. That's still important, but with the e-commerce revolution, the mandatory things that you get fired for are time to ship, order lead time, and order accuracy, because you are disappointing customers otherwise. So you design different, the systems that you design. If you want to design for low cost and high volume, you design the DMV, you design a bureaucracy. If you design for response time and quality of service, you design a fire department. And that shift is what's causing all this. I mean, you don't need desks anymore, you need fire trucks. Right, and that whole thing has changed the way this industry operates. That change is not yet complete. I mean, the good thing of working with a variety of companies is that you get to learn a lot faster than just being in one place. And I see a big range of awareness of this, depending on the industry, depending on the sector, and the maturity of a company. And that revolution is still ongoing, and we haven't seen the end of it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the revolution is still ongoing. There's still a lot of great things that are coming into the industry. And I love what you said there about you don't need a desk anymore. You need the fire truck to be able to address some of these things and make sure that the customer is getting that satisfaction, because it's going to make or break your business at the end of the day. So I want to take it back to something that Pete said there, where, it's you're adding these new technologies in, and we're trying to address some of these problems that have arisen over higher demand from the consumer and expectations and things of that nature. That also brings in more complexity into operations and things like that. And one thing that I really enjoyed about this book is that the three of you all kind of dive into the foundational processes that are behind these automations before then explaining how they're getting automated and some of the example solutions that are addressing some of these processes foundationally. So my question is, there, when we start to look at automation, starting to bring in these different types of technologies, how important is it for these foundational warehousing components to be in place prior to start looking at automation for your operation? And I'll leave that open to whichever one of you wants to chime in first.
Well, let me take a crack at that.
Sure.
So the organization of the book, as you identified, based on the main processes, it also reflects a little bit our collective, the three of us, understanding as we learn how to structure the offerings that we brought to the market for warehouse automation and so on, because if you look at it, it's so complex. It has so many moving parts that it's impossible to know what you're doing. So it was a way to systematize these processes and to organize them, right? And that gives you, I think, the clue on how to think about this is you don't need to have all those processes and everything perfectly clean before you automate, but you really need to understand where are you playing, because the solutions are different and the metrics that you're going to use to measure the success of the implementation are different. So I think the first thing you need to do is why are these processes the foundation, is because they give you the roadmap or the guardrails to be able to contain the problem that you want to solve, right? And then once you have identified that problem, then you can say, okay, what are the technologies that can apply here? What can I bring to bear here? And very importantly, how is this going to affect upstream and downstream in my operations, right? So I think that is the importance of that foundation, and it gives you, it's almost the old trope of systematize before you automate, right? Or systematize before you mechanize, right? So you need to really understand the different parts and where you are playing, right? Because a storage system is a storage system, but it's very different if you're using it for put away and receiving than if you're using it as a forward storage for shipping or for picking, right? So you really need to know what process you are looking at. And I think this organization the organization given the book is a good walkthrough, right? It's fairly intuitive how you walk through from receiving to shipping and all the different pieces in all the different activities in between, right?
Yeah, I would add that I'm working right now fairly closely with a third-party logistics company in Toronto, and what makes them very interesting is that they've been around for a long time, and they perhaps run the most efficient 3PL that I've ever seen, with virtually no automation at all. But they have understood their processes incredibly well, from receiving through shipment. And I would say they have maximized their efficiency given their automation limitations. They then made a relatively minor investment on the shipping and labeling side of their operations. So they began the automation journey there. This has continued to grow. And now they are making a major investment in their picking automation technologies. But they're making these investments very wisely, I would say, because they've been running for a while, growing organically and consistently, and they are picking and choosing exactly when and where to automate because they understand where their bottlenecks are within the whole process. So to the event that you can do that and you have the time to do it and you have the experience within the company to do it, it's certainly a great way to move forward, because it's difficult for companies to automate every process at the same time.
Very interesting there. And I think that's an interesting point too there, where you're talking about, this 3PL is maybe one of the most efficient you've ever seen, and they had no automation really in place. They just understand their processes really well. And I'm curious, if you look at that in contrast with maybe an operation that doesn't understand their processes or well, or maybe has some more inefficiencies. How much of a contrast in experiences would they have if they started to implement some automation or some further level technology?
Well, I think in my mind, at that point, you really need to bring in a consultant. And there are, of course, many consulting organizations that are more than happy to help with your automation decisions and to analyze your business for a whole bunch of money. And in many cases, that makes sense, because so many of these companies just really don't understand where their bottlenecks are. This particular 3PL that I'm referring to, they understand their company and their processes better than most that I've seen. So they are able to internally to make these decisions, and they know where they need to start making their automation investments. But it's been rare in my experience that there is that deep an understanding. It happens from time to time, but I think it's more frequent that companies don't, and they often have to rely on consultants.
Yeah, I agree with you, Pete. And I think if we back it up one step further, I think there's a fundamental decision that an organization has to make as to whether or not they want to have the core competency internally as part of their business model. And, Pete mentioned a 3PL he's working with. So some companies make the strategic decision to say, you know what, this isn't our core competency. Maybe our core competency is the product itself or how we market it. And then they'll leverage a professional firm like a 3PL to manage the distribution for them. However, if you make a decision, at that point, when you're doing that, you're sort of relinquishing, right, control to a certain extent over what's going to happen inside that warehouse, right? And clearly, you'll have metrics and oversight for that. But what we found early in this industry is a lot of times the 3PLs won't automate because they're not incented necessarily to make a long-term investment for perhaps a short-term relationship, right? So but we've seen some changes in how the 3PL organizations have needed to invest, right, to keep up. If you decide that it's strategic and it needs to be in-house, then it's a matter of how do I bring that talent in-house? And I think that's a level of frequency, right? If you're going to build and operate one or two warehouses and it's fairly static, that's one thing. If you look on the other hand of an organization like an Amazon or Walmart or others, that is a core competency that they have in-house, right? Even at that point, having that skill set it's often beneficial to have a couple of trusted partners who are experts in the space, who do this for a living on an ongoing basis, to share those experiences and bring the opportunities to them, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point there, because you do see where a lot of these technologies come into play, and maybe the company has been in the industry for several years, the warehousing company, whether it's a 3PL or just doing their own self-fulfillment, self-distribution. themselves within their own operations. Just because, they've been in the industry for several years doesn't necessarily, like you said, Jim, mean that they have that talent that understands these newer technologies as well. And how do they figure that out? Is it a consultant like Pete mentioned, or is it bringing somebody in-house with that experience to be able to do that? So I'm curious, like along those lines there, I mean, when we look at some of the challenges, because you guys mentioned that, part of the idea behind writing this book and coming up with this book was that there wasn't much out there from the educational standpoint. It was more just kind of trial by fire, learning, just from experience being in the field. And, maybe in some cases, if you didn't get exposure to certain technology or something like that, you wouldn't necessarily learn about that within your career, or you would have to find a different way to learn about that. So when we look at that, I mean, where do you think some of the challenges come in terms of kind of the understanding and the adoption of automation? Because I think there is a little bit of a talent gap there, like internally for companies, especially like those mid-market companies that don't necessarily have like a R&D team or, a extraneous budget to be able to invest or do pilots and things of that nature, like some of the larger players can. I mean, where do you think some of those challenges kind of stem from, and how do you start to overcome those within your organization to be able to get a better understanding and maybe accelerate the adoption of whether it's automation or some of these other newer technologies that are out there?
We'll be back after a quick break.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Do you want more warehouse content delivered to your inbox? Sign up for our new email series called Warehouse Wisdom Wednesday to get an educational series of emails on warehouse basics delivered directly to you every Wednesday morning. Find the sign up link in the show notes.
So I think it's a great question, and I think it's an ongoing challenge and will continue to be, right? Part of what we were targeting, the audience we were targeting with this book would be to help build a base of knowledge of what's available today and understand these foundational processes and understand what technologies are available to somebody. By no means can you read the book and, turn over and go automate your warehouse, right? I mean, obviously a large journey in between that, but we felt that this was a really good place to start, right? So for an organization, for investors, for maybe people who are just curious, for educators, et cetera, this is a great place to start to build the foundation from. And then I agree with Pete. I mean, you got to find a trusted advisor if this is something you're going to explore. And the reason why I use trusted advisor is there's plenty of people that are out there willing to help you, but you need to be careful of whether they have the right viewpoint or not, right? Clearly, if they're selling hammers, everything's going to look like a nail to them. So it's important to find the right partner that can help you explore and understand what your strategic goals are, what the challenges are that you have to solve, and then evaluate the different opportunities. And ultimately, at the end, this becomes very much a mathematical problem for how to solve it, right? With the various options that are on the table. And so making sure that you really understand from an unbiased point of view how these different technologies can be leveraged. And I would say you don't have to start by doing the entire thing, right? I mean, some of the mistakes that I've seen in the industry over the years is trying to do too much at once, especially for somebody who's stepping into the concept of automating. So.
All right. And then Pete, you wanted to say something in there too?
Yeah. And maybe to add to what Jim said, it's funny. I when I first started in this industry, I had heard that about 20% of the warehouses in the world, the legitimate warehouses, are automated even to any degree, meaning 80% of the warehouses continue to run manually. If you fast forward to today, that number continues to be around 80% of the warehouses are running manually today, and only about 20%, maybe it's 21 or 22 or 23%, but the growth in the number of warehouses that have actually invested in automation has been relatively modest as new warehouses, have grown. So there's been a lot of growth in the industry, but it's those same companies, it seems, that are investing more and more and more. Amazon is investing a ton of money, and Walmart is investing a ton. And the 20% that have invested are continuing to invest. But at the lower end, or the medium-sized warehouses, there's been relatively limited adoption. And that's largely been because of the cost, or they don't know where to start. Fundamentally, we've tried to really organize this in a way that you can logically understand what the processes are, understand what the technologies are, and understand what technologies are most likely to actually fit what your company needs based on its size, its anticipated growth, et cetera, because there are so many that are out there. I think what's really encouraging, maybe for the first time that I've seen, and since I've been involved in this industry going forward, is that I think that 20-80 split is going to change dramatically in the course of the next 10 years. Maybe it's going to be 50-50, maybe it's going to be 80-20 in the other direction. And I think it's because of the mobile automation component, the ability to start introducing robots into the environment that allow you to take relatively small, relatively inexpensive automation steps without betting the farm on an automated solution that in many cases was just too expensive for a number of organizations to even consider. So it's a really exciting time because that change is going to be dramatic. And I would also say that the importance of software is growing dramatically as a component of that, because the complexity of efficiently managing and orchestrating the movement of these robots and to do it in an efficient way is much more complicated than the type of software we used to develop in, let's say, bolted to the ground automation equipment that has been developed over the years.
Yeah. Very interesting points there from both you, Jim, and Pete. And I think that underlining kind of that software, and I know you guys have a chapter all about software within the book too, is such an important thing too, because we see visually like the automation, physical aspect, but the software is really kind of what's driving that behind that. Miguel, you want to add to that?
Well, Pete is mentioning that complexity and that drive of software, and also that automation doesn't seem to have penetrated enough, and it's true, and that how that is going to change. Probably. Jim was saying, well, at the same time, there are companies that try to automate end-to-end, and they really have a hard time. And we've seen that the most troublesome automation projects are the ones that are north of the $20 million installation fees, right? And I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. If you start wondering about this, one is that warehousing is falsely perceived as simple, right? So like, well, how hard can it be seen from outside, right? Because everybody has a pantry at home, and like, oh, I put things in, and then when I need them, I take them out, and things like that, right? But with the switch from batch operation in warehouses to this real-time order time leads and so on, that whole thing has changed. And that simplicity lures people to say, oh, okay, well, we're just going to do the same thing, but automated. And they get into these automation projects that they want to be end-to-end, and they fall flat because you compound the technology risk with organizational change risk and with process change risk, and the whole thing just ends up not working. In supply chain and warehousing, as opposed to manufacturing, you have just a few basic operations. You can pick things, you can put things away, you can store them, you can pack them. There's a few of them, and it's very flexible on how you assemble them. Unlike manufacturing, that if you want to drill a hole and paint, you're going to drill the hole first and paint afterwards, because otherwise the thing doesn't work, right? So that flexibility that is intrinsic in supply chain and in material handling operations it creates an enormous complexity on the software, because the software just needs to accommodate all kinds of resequencing, needs to accommodate flexibility of operation, needs to accommodate exceptions in a different way, and that all that complexity is what brings the challenges to these projects, right? And that I think for me, that's the source of that false simplicity and the utter flexibility of operations that you need to control. Those are at the base of why these projects end up being so complex.
Yeah, and I think it's all great insights there from all three of you, and I think certainly that complexity, as you said there, kind of multiple times, certainly adds to it, and being able to control that. And I think it's interesting, especially the software piece that you mentioned there, and being able to ensure that software is able to handle all this complexity that's happening within there. So we have Derek Thorsland up here on stage with us, and I'm guessing Derek has a question or a comment. So Derek, feel free to speak.
All right, thanks, Kevin. And yeah, I think this ties in with what you've been talking about in the last few minutes. So yeah, I'm Derek Thorsland with Kamet, K-A-M-E-T, and just to be transparent, it's a software company focused on risk management for automated systems. But what I was wondering about, you said like 80% are still running manually, they're holding back, and I heard Pete say cost is one of the reasons, and maybe not knowing where to start. But from your conversations with warehouse operations executives, I wondered what you're hearing in terms of like, what are the concerns that are on their minds? What are the big worries that are holding that 80% back from adopting automation?
Well, I'll jump in, and then Jim and Miguel may add some additional comments. Certainly, cost is one, and I think maybe even a bigger one is just not understanding the efficiency or lack of efficiency or bottlenecks that they are facing, or even not understanding the likely growth that their company is going to go through over the next several years. So there's a reluctance to make an investment when there's an uncertainty about what their future is or future growth is likely to look like. So there's a lot of that that's out there. And the point that I was making earlier is that even if you invest modestly in automation and a mechanized solution in a person to goods type environment where you're still employing lots of people, you're just doing the picking more efficiently. These are still several $100,000, $1 million, $2 million automation projects by the time you buy the conveyor systems, the sortation systems, implement the lights, et cetera, and the software that guides these pickers to pick more efficiently, which often is a bigger pill than many of these companies are willing to swallow. So that's been, I think, holding back collectively the lack of understanding, certainty, the risk avoidance, and the raw cost. And the point that I was trying to make is that, these AMRs are getting to the point where for $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, you can buy one AMR and you can start to get a fleet of them, let's say 10 of them in place with orchestration software that runs them. And you're looking at maybe a $250,000 investment for what I would call a starter kit in automation for a certain component of their system. And you start to really feel the benefits of an automation solution that allows you to then build that up over time by growing your fleet of 10 robots to 20 to 50 to 100 to 200, and grow it relatively organically and make these stepwise investment decisions over time. And I think we're going to see a dramatic increase because of that, because the risk tolerance is such that $100,000 or $200,000 initial investment is more in line with what a number of these more reluctant companies are looking to make than what they have, faced in the past. That's my view. The other guys may have slightly different views.
Pete, let me build on that. I mean, clearly, I think fear would be top of my list, right? I mean, it's just the unknown of how to leverage it. And again, when I think of this in terms of the 3 decades of automation, and this is why I believe it will continue to evolve, right? I mean, automation, when I first started in this space, was really only for the Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000, right? And maybe that's the, as Pete thinks of that 80-20 rule, that Pareto, I think of it more like a pyramid, right? The top of the pyramid has found the business case to automate and is willing to take the risk, and almost has to take the risk just given the competitive nature of what they're doing, but hadn't really permeated down further into that pyramid for a variety of reasons. Here's why I think it's going to change, though. Number one is that the factors that are causing the top of that pyramid to automate are the same factors that are hitting those smaller integrators. So whether you're a $50 billion distributor or whether you're a $50 million distributor, land costs are getting higher, labor costs are getting higher. Labor is scarce, right? Everything's moving faster. You've got probably more product to pick from and store. You've got to deliver it. If you're in an e-commerce play, you've got to figure out how to deliver it faster. So this perfect storm that I've talked about is going to hit you whether or not you're a major Fortune 500 company or whether you're somebody smaller in the pyramid. You're still going to have the issues that you have to deal with. The way the industry has been adapting to that, I believe, is this more modular, scalable, flexible solutions that Pete was referring to, that you can, you don't have to bet the farm on. You're going to take some risk, but you can do it in a way that demonstrates value quicker. And you don't have to necessarily bet your career on it. But that warehouse leader in a smaller organizations, I think, it's a change management challenge. It's a fear issue for most of them.
All right. Miguel, you want to add anything to that?
So, yeah, I was saying that it is very little to add to what Jim and Pete were saying, but I think that's the core of the thing. The core of the issue is the trade-off between flexibility and investment. And to be honest, part of the blame here has to go, or part of the reason of why automation does not penetrate more in smaller companies is because of the automation vendors. Automation vendors, up until recently, with the technologies that Peter was mentioning of AMRs and flexible robots and things like that, you talk to one of them and they immediately started putting holes in your floor to bolt equipment in. So when you have to spend a lot of money and that money gets literally bolted to the ground, so that if your product mix is going to change or you're not quite sure of it, or if your regional composition of sales is different or your volumes are different, you need to literally unscrew it from the ground and reconfigure the whole thing at a huge cost. That makes you much more reluctant to invest in automation. So I think with the new generation of, let's call it flexible automation, that you can repurpose and you can reconfigure it much faster. Or in telecommunications, there was this wave of software-defined networks, right? Instead of hardware wired, right? So I think we're starting to see the emergence of software-defined automation, where the hardware itself is flexible enough to reconfigure, right? And that will make it much more accessible to smaller, more uncertain operations. There is also another thing that I think is going to contribute to the penetration of automation in the coming years is the emergence of the distribution as a service, which is the new fashion of 3PLs, is the distribution as a service. And the biggest distribution as a service company in the world right now is Amazon, right? If you're a small company, you send your pallets to Amazon and you send the orders and they will fulfill it for you, right? And that Amazon itself and the smaller competitors like ShipMonk and ShipBob and so on, those are consolidating the volume, and they're going to have enough volume to be able to invest in these technologies, right? And I think we're going to start seeing some of that too.
All right, great, and very insightful answers from all three of you there. And Derek, thank you very much for the question. Definitely check out Kamet. Disclosure as well, I'm on the advisory board as an advisor, so definitely check them out too. And then we have Ed Kennedy up here for a question as well. Ed, good to see you. It's been a little while since I saw you last.
Thanks, Kevin. So kind of back to, these smaller operations, automation can come all different shapes and sizes. Obviously, you can do lights out from the very beginning, but are you seeing in these smaller companies that we have such a shift in the workforce where human capital is still a play? What are you advising these companies where, these generations coming in now grew up with technology, they're used to it, and that the fear of retention, where they have to have some level of labor, by not automating, what risk are these companies facing by not jumping in sooner than later?
Okay, well, I think it's interesting in that I think the first thing that I would say is that labor in warehouses is becoming increasingly difficult to get, and particularly for those unpleasant jobs. So there's a natural need here for automation because you just can't hire the people in the quantities that you need them that you perhaps could 5, 10, 15 years ago. So it's almost forcing at least some level of automation. I have not found that the pushback has been strong, even in smaller companies. Most are excited about at least introducing some level of automation into their companies. If it's a pick-to-light system or a conveyance system or AGVs or something that makes their job easier, more pleasant, takes some of the hard labor away. And that's where a lot of that investment has taken place. There's a fundamental decision that many of these companies need to make. Am I going to go to a goods to person type solution where you really flip the operation of the warehouse upside down and on its head? Or am I going to take a manual operation and make it work better by introducing mechanization in a pick to goods type solution, which interestingly enough is the direction that historically more companies in North America have done in let's make my manual operation run more efficiently. I have quite a bit of space in rural areas and I can mechanize my operation, where Europe space has been historically at an even greater premium. They need to use the volume of the warehouse and they make these bigger decisions to move to a goods to person ASRS type solution. So it's varied all over the place. It's those big investments that sometimes cause a little bit of consternation in the warehouse operation staff, that what is this actually going to mean to me? Where the smaller shift to a mechanized person to goods type solution or an AMR assisted type operation, I have found has been adopted quite happily by the warehouse staff and the companies.
Yeah, and the only nuance I would add to that, Pete, would be the problem's exacerbated for those shippers that are dealing with seasonality, right? So I worked with a 3PL who probably did 40-50% of their volume in the last 3 months of the year, right? Given the holiday season. And so the operation could run fairly efficient with some level of technology for most of the year, but to try to triple the labor, the picking labor in particular, for the last 3-4 months of the year was just almost impossible, right? And not just finding the resources, but if you could find the resources, you'd pray that you could get them back the next day, right? Because there was turnover within the turnover. So automation, and in particular the flexible automation that allows you to ramp up for a 3 to 4 month period and then ramp back down to a normal operating period, is something that I think has solved a lot of problems for those seasonal type shippers as well.
There is one aspect here of that whole problem that is not for the companies implementing automation, but is for the vendors, system vendors, and so on, which is, you mentioned it briefly, Ed, that the new workers in warehouses, they are digital natives. That's one thing. And second, the instability of that workforce means that you really cannot afford to train them, right? You really need to have them jump in, very minimal training, and give them an RF terminal or a mobile terminal and go, right? So the emphasis on, I call it customer grade usability and customer grade user experience for those workers is growing and growing in importance. And I don't think the vendors are aware enough yet to have, I don't see in the companies I work with, I rarely see one that has a user experience department or people with user experience in their business card. And I think that is going to have to come, because literally you cannot train people. You cannot train people on how to do things. You need to have the user interface. You need to have the system itself, get them up to speed and make them productive right away. So that's one thing. The other thing is in the switch between person to goods and goods to person, the unifying trend there is that until we see a mainstream robotic picking, which is not there yet, and much less mobile robotic picking, the emphasis is to keep the workers using their hand-eye coordination and the degrees of freedom they have in both hands, and do not have them walking around. So that means faster switch to goods to person, or solutions that relieve the worker from moving around the warehouse by having the AMRs in a follow me type of capacity and so on. And those kinds of solutions, I think you're starting to see, to keep the human doing the hand-eye coordination that robots are still not there yet.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think that's such an interesting point there too, Miguel, around the user experience and having actually like a user experience person within your operation and on staff. And I know, Ed, you've done a lot of work around user experience from like handheld devices and things of that nature as well. So any thoughts from you there, Ed?
Yeah, I 100% agree with Miguel that onboarding is critical, because operations people, they're dealing with various different forms of talent, including gig, and that these people want to walk in a door. They want to be able to have something that's intuitive. It has to be an exceptional UX, and they want to get out on the floor and they want to do their work and they want to exceed their labor standard. So in these smaller companies, that those where that type of work is still required, these companies really need to embrace that, because that's the talent they need to retain. And I agree with Miguel that UX is very important. And it can all start with the UI at first.
Yeah. And just to clarify, when I say UX is UX, but it brings the whole system behind, because to be able to provide a good UX user experience, the system needs to keep so much context on what's going on to be able to guide you. So so that the user does not need to remember where the red pencils are, right? Or how many of them were last time you visited there. And what is the next thing you need to pick? All this kind of information and the algorithms that keep all those things flowing with multiple workers. It is the responsibility of the system to keep all those balls in the air.
Very good points there all around. And thank you, Ed, for asking a question here and coming up on stage. And really appreciate Jim, Pete, and Miguel for joining me here on this live edition of the New Warehouse podcast today. If you haven't gotten the book, The Warehouse Revolution, Automate or Terminate, make sure you get a copy of it. I would say it is a must read. For anybody in the warehousing industry, whether you've been in for a while or you're just entering into the industry. And I think I've seen several people comment the same or similar things on LinkedIn as well. So Jim, Pete, Miguel, thank you once again. And for all things The New Warehouse, check out thenewwarehouse.com. So thank you all very much and have a great rest of the week. Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from The New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.